we can take place, please? Thank you very much to all. Welcome to Villa Mondragone and to the University of Vergata. Our Mr. President is here for the welcome remarks.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Diurni. Dear all, I am honored to welcome you in this beautiful scenario, the ancient Villa Mondragone, which is the event and congress center of the University of Vergata since 14 years. Let me thank to Professor Amalia Diurni for inviting me to greet the international conference planned by the PRIN 2020, a project on digital vulnerability in European private law, a key project in collaboration with the academic institution through Italy, which is leading to truly meaningful results thanks to the diversity of perspectives and skills that each university brings. Today, you will discuss on a real important subject about human vulnerability in interaction with artificial intelligence. What emerged in legal discourses is that in our current and pervasively digitalized world, it is necessary to analyze how digital technologies impact on pre-existing forms of human vulnerability or create new ones. At the same time, it is essential to understand how law can prevent or address unequal experiences of technology. After the inaugural conference held at University of Ferrara last year, this second meeting in Rome aims to explore the realm of human-machine interaction, focusing on the debate on the identification of the dynamics in human-machine interaction and emerging vulnerability models, and on current or future or legal regulations to govern these interactions in a friendly manner with humans and mitigate the associated risks. The wide program is very interesting, thanks to the presence of prestigious and authoritative guests. Through a multidisciplinarity approach, you will explore the functioning of correct private law regulations, social, economic, and political structures, human mind compared to artificial neural networks and big data models. Let me finally express my pleasure and satisfaction to see that the meeting also gives the opportunity to the young PhD students to present the best papers selected through a special call of papers. This reflects the awareness of the importance of supporting new research in shaping the future and addressing the challenges of contemporary world. I'm sure that all authoritative speakers gathered today with their competence and knowledge will provide us to certain food of thought. I therefore leave the floor to my colleagues, and I wish you all a fruitful day. Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. And will be also the Dean of the faculty and the Director of the Department of Management and Law. But unfortunately, they are also in other conferences abroad. So this is a time where everybody have conferences. I don't know if in such a beautiful place as we have in Vergata, but thank you very much indeed. So we have, as you said, created not just a connection between different sciences and experts. So Professor Nathan Levialdi Ghiron is an engineer. So and here we have also sociologists, philosophers, and experts in the health sector that are trying to have a dialogue with jurists. And the new generation are also here, so that the dialogue is not just multidisciplinary, but also intergenerational. And this is something that we know that you appreciate particularly in your university, and you stressed on international relationship and in the in challenges to communicate knowledge, but not just knowledge, also a vision to the new generation. So thank you very much indeed. So I think we can start with the first session. Please, I leave the floor to... Bianca, Gardella, Tedeschi. So the first, hello, hi. So the first session, we have at the chair Professor Michele Sorice, that is a sociologist and professor at Sapienza University in media and communication. I'll leave you the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure and also an honor to open this session of the second day of this very interesting and very intriguing conference. My task is to give you a sort of short contribution that is a sort of introduction to this specific panel. I will speak about a specific topic that is beyond liminality, digital technologies between inclusion and citizenship. As you can understand, is a very big topic. It means that I will speak more or less about 3 hours.
That's fine. We're happy.
No, it's on a joke, of course.
We're very happy, so
no.
We are free. Thank you.
We are jurists, we are used to.
No, absolutely. So anyway, it's only a joke, of course. I will keep my contribution in 15 minutes, no more. And at the same time, I will give the floor immediately after my contribution to my colleagues, and to have also the time for, if possible, a short discussion and a Q&A. That is probably the most important thing that we can have in a conference. In many cases, we have time to present our papers and no time to discuss our papers, unfortunately. But we will try to have this time. And the first effort that I have to do immediately is to short this introduction, to stop this introduction, and to go immediately to my contribution. So when we speak about liminality, usually we have to put in connection this concept with that of space. So there are 2 basic concepts that we have to consider: liminality and space. And liminality and space are usually strongly interconnected, also because when we speak about liminality, we are referring to a specific liminal space. It's a big tautologic, but it's absolutely true. The liminal spaces are defined as spaces characterized by both process of refiguration due to the so-called polycontextualization, deep mediatization as stated by Andreas Hepp, and translocalization, and as well as, second point, process of marginalization, vulnerabilization, and gentrification, and also probably defamiliarization. A lot of complicated concepts with all these Asian that are a sort of complicated concepts coming from the social sciences. So this is an occasion for me also to say that I'm very happy to be here as a sociologist in a consensus in which we have absolutely the minority, but at the same time it's an occasion to have a dialogue with other field of interest, a field of science, and I think that Professor Amalia Diurni has been very smart to create this occasion to put together different disciplines. So, sorry in advance for the use of this concept coming from social sciences, but unfortunately they are absolutely necessary to explain my position on this topic. So, a liminal space lies on the border of two dominant spaces, not fully part of either. Spaces such as these are not easily defined in terms of use and are not clearly owned by a particular party. This is in direct contrast to dominant spaces that are defined by main uses, which have clear boundaries and where practices within them are intertwined with social expectations, routines, and norms. These are spaces in transition, where individual and collective identities remain fluid or anchored to the even deviant specificities of the territories. They belong to such spaces that they become familiar and are taken for granted in the landscape of everyday life. We assume, I have to assume here, that when communities inhabit liminal spaces and consider them vital and meaningful in their everyday lives, they cease to be ambiguous spaces and become transitional dwelling places that give meaning to the activities, languages, and instances that develop there. Liminal communities are refigured space undergoing profound transformation owing to both endogenous and exogenous phenomena, where the first major change concerns figuration. To analyze the process of the construction of social reality, Norbert Elias introduced the term figuration as a conceptual tool to grasp the complex problems of the interdependence that the coexistence of large numbers of humans generates and how these problems are solved. Elias argues that social change is always partly a change at the figuration level. Following Elias, the fundamental idea is to understand the enduring social formations of human beings as figurations constituted by the interdependencies and interactions of the individuals involved. They can be characterized by a certain balance of power, for example, the power relations constituted by the interdependencies themselves. The boundaries of each figurations are defined by the shared meaning that the individuals involved produce through interrelated social practices, which is also the basis of their mutual orientation. Liminal communities are understood in this frame as figurations of figuration, as several figurations can coexist within them, in a transition, of course. In addition to traditional figurations such as families, formal and informal interest groups, social conformations living in complete illegality, for example, the organized crime, or on the borders of legality, for example, the precarious and undeclared pious work, social actors and civil society with organizational and management peculiarities, precarious small-scale crafts and entrepreneurial paths and formation constitute liminal communities. Regardless of the value connotations we assign to the figures, they all experience external pressures for change and multiple internal pressures to find a new balance in the social practices of everyday life. The second aspect that characterizes the process of the refiguration of liminal communities, the so-called polycontextualizations, refers precisely to the multiplication of contexts and frames to which people simultaneously react, sometimes creating overlaps, sometimes conflict, or even mutual indifference. The presence of very different cultures and subcultures within the same social space is one of the most important concepts of the contextualization, as it has been fueled in the last 30 years in Western countries by numerically significant migration processes. Another relevant aspect in social capital in the process of the constructions of liminal space is the social capital. Many liminal communities have a high intensity of social relations, but are more segregated than other communities, even spatially contiguous ones. Rather than bonding or bridging social capital, it becomes more important to speak of segregated and privatized social capital, and in some cases, this type of social capital becomes a resource for liminal communities. At this level, the digital ecosystems plays an important role. The second concept that we have to discuss at this point is that of spatiality. Spatiality has assumed centrality in people's social and media practices, transforming the way of doing community towards greater flexibility and widespread molecularization on the one hand, and towards unprecedented forms of social innovation and resistance on the other, at least in some respects. For example, some micro-community experiences also seem to have taken up the characteristics of the workers' mutuality in the late of 19th century, but with a focus on ties with the territory rather than on ties born within the work context, or summing up both aspects, as in the case of the collective linked to the experience of the GKN of Campi Bisenzio near Florence, which was born from work experience and that has turned into a sort of modern workers' mutual aid society, capable of also moving into the sphere of training and cultural promotion in the territory. Urban spaces are not only those where contemporary community experiences can be traced, but also those where it's possible to trace a higher relational density among the members that make it up, or to which they say and feel they belong. The feeling of belonging to a community puts the question of emotions at the center, which becomes relevant for many experiences born and consolidated within digital spaces. On the other hand, on critical positions regarding the role of digital worlds as emotional and community spaces, Sherry Tarkle highlights the pitfalls and problems of isolation associated with digital media practices. Regardless of the positions regarding the role played by digital, emotional, and value-based belonging, is a further element that changes how community is made today, adding a dimension of complexity that, although present in the past, today takes on unexpected centrality. Building on the recent reflections of Stefan Sanz and Emiliano Treré, the concept of social practice was conceived in an attempt to overcome the dualism between structure and agency, determinism and voluntariness, and challenges prevailing ways of thinking about subjectivity and sociality. Practice theory encompasses a variety of approaches. Pierre Bourdieu's habitus theory and Tony Giddens' structuration theory, which in different ways attempted to reconcile the structure-agency dualism in social theory, are commonly regarded as first-generation theories of practice. The turn of the 21st century saw the emergence of a second generation of practice theorists who sought to systematize and extend practice theory by refining definitions and elaborating on the relationship between practices, social order, and social change. Although there is no universally agreed upon definition of practices, most social practice theorists agree that they encompass a combination of activities and shared material and cultural objects. Here, at this regard, we would like to mention some relevant cases of the use of digital technologies as tools for inclusion, or in other cases, as tools to support bottom-up actions by vulnerable actors, or as a tools to connect forms of direct action, direct social action. I'm thinking here of the case of the Belgian Citizens Platform for Refugee Support, a genuine experience of self-representation in which the logic of direct representation becomes an instrument of countervailing power. Another case is that of the Pellaro district of Reggio Calabria in southern Italy, analyzed very well by Andrea Volterrani, who is here, and Alessio Ceccarelli in an article a few years ago. In this case, the process consisted of activating a community development process in a hybrid characterized by a large vulnerable population and a high density of organized crime. Direct action in the area was based on a theoretical approach that referred to urban and media practices and the mediated constructions of social reality. The activation of the community development had in this case focused on the intertwining of deep mediatization and the everyday lives of people in the neighborhood. In particular, actions were developed that enabled the growth of social and digital and social skills among the most vulnerable people. From an edu-communication perspective, as theorized by Barbas in 2020, these people were enabled to become protagonists in the process of territorial and digital relationships between, also thanks to the use of participation and community platforms, both commercial and co-constructed by citizens and made easily accessible even to those with less basic digital skills. Volterrani and Ceccarelli, among others, noted that in this context, the capacity to develop dual, social and digital relation in a peripheral, marginal and vulnerable community context, such as that of southern Italy, appeared to be strong, and furthermore, the potential of digital media to respond to the specific needs of the population was highlighted, for whom digital tools guaranteed forms of empowerment and, as I said before, edu-communication from below. Another case in a different perspective from the first two is the role of the so-called hyperlocal media, which is also increasingly central to the significant decline of traditional journalistic models. It is precisely the possibilities offered by the internet and digital technologies that enable hyperlocal initiatives to strengthen civic engagement in territories and to act as a site and resources for local deliberative processes. Many studies in this direction have been carried out in the last 5-6 years in different parts of the world, especially in Northern Europe and also in Russia, at least before the invasion of Ukraine. In particular, hyperlocal media do not only provide the information, but also contribute to community building and often act as instruments of civic mediation, sometimes even beyond their own expectations and even beyond their own projects. An important concept to conclude this short contribution is that of mediatization, not in the original meaning of the media logic prevailing on the political logic that is typical of the political communication studies, or at least not only. The concept of deep mediatization, as stated by Andreas Hepp in this case, refers to a general process involving institutions and societal organizations. In liminal communities, both types of mediatization are co-present with potential processes of both profound territorialization and profound deterritorializations. The process of territorialization are those that characterize a community's rootedness in a specific territory, while those of deterritorializations are those that break the link between nature, the territory, and the community's culture. In this context, the efforts of the platform society make users feel most powerful because they intervene in strong and territorially rooted identity processes by modifying their characteristics and peculiarities in unexpected directions. For example, the use of social media in liminal communities sometimes doesn't go in the direction that platforms imagine for all other contexts of intensifying relationships. Rather, it is used to maintain social ties that only take meaning in the everyday lives of liminal communities. On the other hand, the media ecosystems of liminal communities are flattened at the level of commerce and thus consumption, greatly limiting opportunities for the growth of public and collective spaces. There are, of course, attempts at emancipation from commercial platforms that allow for autonomy and singularity in the media ecosystems of liminal community, as, for example, in the case of platform cooperativism experiences. However, this clashes with a more general problem of growing digital inequalities that interact with existing economic, cultural, and social ones. It is not for chance that many of us have been individuating a structural connection between mediatizations, and in particular the deep mediatizations, and the process of platformizations. The digital ecosystems, also in the light of the emergence of the different forms of artificial intelligence, can play an important role in the development of the so-called hybrid participation. It is a process involving online perspectives and on-site experiences of citizenship participation. Of course, there is a continuity between on-site and digital that is now established in life experiences, even among non-digital natives. Another dimension of hybrid participatory processes lies on the continuum between formality and informality. Examples of the first are participatory processes that can be imagined and constructed within urban regeneration path within a public institutional framework. They often have the characteristics of a top-down practices or process with the sole purpose of building consensus on choices that have already been made without giving people a chance for real and effective participation. This is what I usually define as disconnected participation. Examples of the second aspect, on the other hand, are the participatory processes that arise spontaneously based on different stimuli. I want here to underline that there are no perfect participatory processes, but rather paths that intersect the process of refiguration of liminal communities, developing spaces and contexts, sometimes of development, often of resistance, even to the mobilizing logic of populism and innovation. In this frame, the platform, and in particular the platform AI-based, and generally speaking, the algorithmic media, and of course their affordances, can play a role in fostering citizenship. But first of every technological tool, it's necessary to politically redefine citizenship as a set of community skills, also recovering the Aristotelian tradition coming from the concept of koinonein. A democratic perspective continues to be the background for a democratic use of technologies that, as we know, are never neutral. I want here to conclude my introductory presentation, thanking Professor Andrea Volterrani for his contribution, because some of these reflections comes from a common ground based on research that we have been working on in the last 3 years. So thank you very much. And now I have another role that is, so I changed my, as you know, in Italian politics, it's very common to change to change the shirts and the jacket. So it's very common. So sorry for this bad attitude of Italian politics. Even if we are not politicians, in this case I have to change my shirts as a politician to take another role, that is that of the chairperson, and I have to give immediately the floor if I found the program. I don't remember. Oh, here. I don't know if I have to follow probably the specific order as defined. Better. So I give immediately the floor to Professor Alessandro Mantelero, who comes from the Polytechnic University of Turin. His contribution, his speech is titled Facing the Challenges of AI, the FRIA and AI Act, a pragmatic approach to the fundamental rights in socio-technical regulation. I give to him immediately the floor, and thanks for your patience.
Thank you very much to Professor Sorice. Thank you to colleagues, in particular Amalia Duni, and you all for being here today. I think the presentation will start, but also without presentation, I can start introducing the topic that, although was not coordinated, there is a sort of connection between the previous presentation, because you mentioned the tool of inclusion and empowerment. And if we see in the presentation, we anticipate that in the presentation there is a series of picture, because I ask to the being co-pilots to look at streets in different areas. A street in Asia, a street in Europe, a street in Africa, and street in America. Huh? Yeah, I see. So if you look at this picture, all the discussion about inclusion, empowerment, and decontextualization, data realization is evident. Huh? This is a clear stereotyping representation of these different areas, including the fact that a street in America necessarily have a US flag that is not just the only country in America, and the fact that in Africa the streets are by definition by dust, there is no an alternative. And while in Europe we have a sort of mixture of a Nordic and Mediterranean approach in some picture. So why I start from this street? Because I think this is an example of the technology mediation and what is the impact that is well known also in sociological studies and philosophical studies, the impact of technology mediation on the representation provided to us by the AI. Why this raises some concern from a legal and ethical perspective? First of all, because when we talk about AI, we talk about oracles. We are not all professor of law, professor of sociology, or expert. But AI is largely for dummies. It's for people that ask to AI, please give me a picture of a street in Africa. And this is the street in Africa, and that's it. Huh? And so this is the problem. We are talking about a system that gives us a feedback, but this feedback is based on data. There is a strong data dependency. And the way in which this data have been used to create this system, of course, impact in terms of stereotyping and impact in terms of tyranny of majority. Because if you collect with what you find online as the large language model has been created, but not just a large language model, because when you create an AI, typically you use histories. You use a historical series of data. And this is the typical approach. There is a famous case in UK. They use for training a machine the data of an hospital, a specific hospital, in order to give the same tool to all the hospitals in UK to have feedback from the machine in terms of medical practice, and the machine provides the medical practice that was common in that hospital. As you said, that the medical sector is quite like the legal sector, in which there is not only one opinion. the doctor from different hospitals say, oh, but this maybe my colleagues do that, but I never do that. And so they reject the system. So this is the problem of the stereotyping, the series of data. But of course, in this case, also a problem of diversity and lack of diversity. In this sense, there is a tyranny of majority, because it reflects the point of view of the majority of the people. The majority of people think that a street in America is in a street in the US, is in a street with a US flag. And the second point is that if we use this system, for instance, in many applications relating to the task of the government, for instance, social aid, again, we have problem, different kind of categories of problem. There was a project that was carried out in Latin America, for instance, for social aid, and they used some parameters in order to train the AI, in order to decide who was entitled or not to receive some support, we can say. And the idea is that if you have a quite high energy consumption, or if you have quite a recent car, you are considered that your income, your economic condition is not so bad, so you cannot receive nothing. But What is the problem? It's the problem that people that are rich people live in energy efficient houses and poor people in non-energy efficient houses. And so the higher consumption is related also to the bad condition and the low condition in terms of economic power. And the car, in many cases, was a recent car because they use the car to travel around to selling things. And so they need a car that works properly because they invest everything in their car. And who designed the system didn't understood this kind of dynamics. Because, as I say to my students, we, in many cases, leave the computer scientist alone, imagining the world outside and reflecting his or her perspective in this sense. The third example of a critical problem in terms of representation of society through AI, so the mediation of technology, is related to the context of use. So it's not just data, it's not just the parameter of the system, but also the context of use. We have created a beautiful AI system for X-ray analysis, for instance, but this system has been developed in some African countries in which the equipment that you use for X-ray is low in terms of quality. And so the performance of the AI system, of course, is bad, because the image is bad. Not because the AI is not good, but because the image is bad. So the context of use is something that is important. Unfortunately, the EU legislator has missed this point because they say that the risk is focused on AI and has missed the fact that it's not just AI, but has all the product. The risk is related to the product and the context in which the product is used. The last case is the famous Lavender case. Lavender, for if you don't know, is the system of arm that is used by Israeli army in order to bomb Gaza, supposed to be an intelligent system, and is so intelligent that has created a massive killing of people in Gaza. But what is interesting here is the interaction between the machine and the humans, because at a certain point, this is not is in the paper. There is an investigation by journalists, international investigation that has been published. At a certain point, they realized that there was not enough target. And so they asked the soldier to put new number, new target in the system. And the system was generated based on the fact that if there is just one target, you can expand up to 20 people potentially killed. This was the system as this is a declaration by the staff of the Ministry of Defense about the functioning. So this is an example how it's not just the machine, but it's interaction between the humans and the machine, because it's not the vendor that has created the target. It's someone that has decided that certain people can be considered a potential target. And that is expanded based on the algorithm, of course. So these are the elements that affect the technology mediation. So this is quite complicated scenario. In this complicated scenario, of course, the impacts are in terms of underrepresentation, lack of participation, misrepresentation, and power design. That are what we have just discussed. How we can react to that? We can try to regulate, and this the focus of this presentation, so the regulation of the AI, and more specifically the AI Act in Europe. Why we need this regulation? We need this regulation for a series of reasons. The first one is that, of course, there is a lack of responsible innovation. We discussed in Europe for many years about responsible innovation. They put ChatGPT online, available by everyone. You can create bombs. Now we can. It's more difficult to create bombs. You have to tell a history. If you ask, please tell me a tale in which there is a kid that want to create a bomb, the bomb comes back. But so this is against the approach that we have in terms of responsible innovation. It's a market-driven approach. Those that have money and want to make money put products and do not consider the risk. Also, limited the power of internal ethics committee, as happened in these cases. The second point, in terms of regulatory perspective, so we have this series of needs to face. For this reason, we need the regulation. But the regulation has two forms. There is the regulation in the countries that are AI developing countries and countries that are mainly AI adopting countries. We are not US, we are not China, we are not big champions. What it means, while in the countries that have champions in the field of AI, they can use political pressure, informal pressure, or following Reidenberg Lex Informatica, using the bully pulpits. It means, like in the presidential order in US, you go to the company and say, dear friends, it's nice to develop an AI that is more consistent with our value. And the company understands, because of course they have to negotiate with the government, and so there is a trade-off. In Europe, you cannot do the same, because are not your company, are not your territory. And so, of course, it's not the case that in Europe, like in Brazil, I have the opportunity and the honor to advise the Brazilian Senate on this topic. There is a similarities between the AI Act in Brazil and in Europe, because both focus on risk and both focus on the concern about product that comes in our country but are not produced. And so we have to align with our values. And this is not the famous Brussels effect, because Brazil has no any interest in make business in Europe. Is the fact that there are countries that are in the same position in terms of AI adopting countries. And by the way, this is also interesting because they break the traditional logic of global south and global north. Now the global south from digital perspective involve European countries such as Brazil, that in terms of traditional categories are in two different realms. So in this sense, the AI Act is a reference framework for many countries, and also is an attempt, is a test, is a first generation law. This is things that we have to keep in mind. We cannot compare the GDPR, that is the last stage of a long process, with the AI Act. The AI Act, as all the first generation laws, have to compromise, to find a compromise between the pressure for development technology and the risk that technology brings. So in this sense, it's normal that focus on a more limited scope, prohibition, high-risk case, and also adopting a quite critical solution in terms of listing the high-risk case. But this approach was in order to facilitate the industry, in order to make possible the industry to invest. So in this sense, regardless the criticism, the AI Act is very industry-friend regulation, we can say, because it limits the action of the regulation and facilitate it through a, we see how manageable list of cases, what is in, what is out. I'm skeptical about the list, but we can use for discussion. Of course, there are other shortcomings, the lack of a participatory mechanism that is very important in AI design. And the typical approach that we have in the AI Act is the approach of product safety regulation, including an element of fundamental rights. And this is a balancing exercise. So the logic is safety, security, and fundamental rights. Of course, there are some challenges to face. The first one is that we don't focus a lot on the implementation. If you look at the executive order in US, there are more elements in terms of concrete aspects concerning the implementation. In Europe, all the part of implementation is left to the Commission, to further acts, to the national authorities, etc. And the big point is also the lack of specific model in terms of risk assessment, considering that risk assessment is the core element. So if we look at the AI Act, the most important aspect in terms of innovation from the regulatory perspective is the fundamental rights impact assessment. Because in terms of safety and security and standardizations, it's nothing new. We already have in industry regulation many examples of this kind of approach. Standards in order to mitigate risk for cars, for trains, whatever you want. The fundamental rights impact assessment is something that was in the European Parliament proposal and was introduced by Rapporteur Benifei. And the idea was to consider the impact on fundamental rights. Again, this is not new. Many of you, you know that we have experience in the context of human rights impact assessment, but human rights impact assessment is quite different because it usually is a policy tool and is an ex post tool. This is no longer a policy tool. This is an obligation, is a requirement, and is an ex ante requirement. So it's quite different in nature. The fundamental rights impact assessment related to the context of this conference is a powerful tool for inclusion, because through the fundamental rights and the variety of fundamental rights, of course, we give voice also to minority, we give voice to vulnerable subject, etc. Of course, the problem of fundamental rights is to properly frame the methodology of fundamental rights. There are not a lot of studies in this field, and there's also a lot of confusion in some studies in this field. And the second point that is important to highlight is that the fundamental rights impact assessment is not just Article 27, it's not just an obligation of the deployer, but it's also part of the conformity assessment. So the assessment that should be carried out by the provider, because the provider have to consider also the impact on the fundamental rights. Unfortunately, unfortunately, in the mind of the Commission, this assessment should be carried out through standardization, and it is quite difficult to imagine that we can standardize also the fundamental rights part of this conformity assessment. So if we look at the fundamental rights impact assessment in the AI Act, so Article 27, the Article 27 was unfortunately squeezed a bit during the trilogue. The text that the Parliament presented, also with the collaboration with the academia, as was mentioned yesterday, we tried to put a more clear description also in terms of elements of the key components of fundamental rights impact assessment. But during trilogue, we had against both the Commission and the Council, and so we had to accept a sort of compromise that affect both the description of the process and also the scope of the fundamental rights impact assessment that is more limited. So these in the list are the key elements that now we find in Article 27. For time constraint, I just focus on the last point that in terms of legal interpretation is most interesting, because as usual, the impact assessment means that you have to assess the risk and then to mitigate the risk. And in Article 27, and this is a case of lost in transition, the measure to be taken refers to the measure to be taken where those risks materialize. The materialization of risk in terms of linguistic term, it means when the arms exist. But this interpretation doesn't make sense in the context of the fundamental rights impact assessment for several reasons. The first one is the logic interpretation, the argument, the logic interpretation, because the materialization of risk is not necessarily the harm. You realize a risk in the moment in which you design a product. When, for instance, you create robots like Boston Dynamics robots, you realize that these robots can kill person. So you know the risk, although the robots is not just killing person. And not to make big example, in the atomic energy was the same. We don't need the bomb in order to understand the problem. So in terms of logical argument, the materialization differs, the materialization of risk differs from the materialization of harm. And the second argument is the systemic interpretation. If we look at Article 7.2c of the Commission, the Council proposal, in that article there was a reference to the materialization that in the last test of Article 7 is likelihood of harm. So also in the textual term, what was originally described as a materialization then became likelihood. Likelihood means something that is about a probabilistic and an ex ante assessment, stressing again the fact that the materialization is interpreted in the logic of something that is before the harm. It's part of the analysis of the scenario. Then we can use a typical legal, sorry for no legal, a typical legal argument that is the a contrario argument. And if you look at the a contrario argument, of course, it doesn't make sense to use, to consider Article 27 in reference to the risk materialized as measure that you adopt when the risk is already produced, because it's against the logic of the risk assessment and the risk-based approach that has been adopted by the IACT. If you just mitigate what already happened, is not risk assessment, is compensation or many other tools. So in terms of a contrary argument. And the final element, if you look at the text of Article 27, there is a reference to prior to the performance or impact assessment prior to developing of the design. So prior, it means ex ante. There is reference to the damage that they may produce, and there is a reference to likelihood in several parts. All these textual elements confirm that when we talk about materialization of risk, we talk about the risk that we can envisage through scenario exercise or many other similar exercises in the traditional approach of human rights impact assessment and fundamental rights impact assessment. Sorry for this long explication, but it's also part of my last paper on this point, but it's, I think, an important point, because the trilogue has squeeze a lot of the text, and there is the risk that the misinterpretation of the text lead to consider risk assessment just a list of potential risk, full stop. This is not fundamental rights impact assessment. Fundamental rights impact assessment is looking at the risk and the mitigation. So the key elements, of course, in terms of methodological approach is the focus on the deployer. A contextual assessment is not standard-based. And there are some entities that are the only that have this kind of obligation. This was the trade-off when, as consultant of the benefit team, asked if we agree about this trade-off, as mentioned in the discussion with Frank this morning. We say yes. It's better than nothing, okay? It's better having fundamental rights impact assessment from public bodies, credit words, etc., rather than not having. By the way, we know that when we start having some practice, then consolidate. In terms of implementation, just briefly, there is, as usual, a first stage in fundamental rights impact assessment that is awareness raising, can be also carried out using question or other forms. The basic task is to look at what are the potentially impacted rights. Then we have the risk analysis, and we have the impact assessment analysis. In the impact assessment analysis, we cannot use just a theoretical legal approach. We need to have an assessment, so provide evidence, also in terms of accountability. Typically, we use matrix for that, in which we combine the two main variables that are likelihood and gravity. And this matrix make possible to give evidence how these rights and the impact on them is considered. What is important, I want to underline, is the methodological issues and the misunderstanding that are related to the methodological issue. In several proposals, including proposal from Alan Turing Institute or UNESCO, there are some misunderstanding. The first case is the use of variables to assess the risk concerning the fundamental rights. These variables, in many cases, are provided a weight, but it's not clear the weighting. Sociologists know well. For instance, the model adopted by the Canadian government on impact assessment OII provide the values to different variables without any criteria, any explicit criteria. We assume there is a criteria, but it's not explicit. The second error mistake is the cumulative assessment. From a legal perspective, we know that fundamental rights are protected, each rights. We cannot merge the rights. You cannot say the risk is high for privacy, but is low for freedom of expression, so there is an average that is medium. This is not possible. Each right should be individually assessed. The third point is the fact that sometimes there is a fragmentation of these rights that lead to a redundancy and to the effect of double counting, because if the same rights is counted under two forms, of course, it is not properly assessed. Finally, when you use a matrix and radial graph, we should be very careful For instance, in some matrix, there is an overestimation of some aspects. I remember the Alan Turing Institute model, in which they use a range from 0 to 4 for likelihood and severity. But for severity, there are two variables. So 0 to 4 for 2 times against 0 to 4 for 1 time. Of course, this shift the balance in order to have another representation of severity that is possible from a statistical perspective, but should be justified. Yeah. So this is an element. The second point, in terms of using on matrix, you have to use scale, so intense, medium, low, high, etc., and not use number. I have seen very absurd models, including the ranking in terms of number of human rights and the mathematical combination of human rights. Okay, it's okay, use some tools coming from statistics, but not too much, please. And the last point, we have to recognize that this is an expert-based exercise, as all the assessment. So the old refrain, but the people can make mistake, is too individualistic, is the same in all the sector if you have not an assessment that is based on physical measurement. Of course, if you consider the level of pollution of a river, you don't need an expert assessment, is by definition. And the last 1 minute is about what is behind the AI Act. First, the Fundamental Rights Impact Assessment is not just Article 27. Fortunately, fundamental rights are protected regardless the AI Act, so it means that it's not a legal obligation to carry out the Fundamental Rights Impact Assessment. You, as a creator of an AI, have to be careful in order not to impact on these rights, because, of course, there's a legal protection for these rights. This means that the Fundamental Rights Impact Assessment is not just an obligation, but should become a best practice in order to avoid some litigation. Now we have many cases of NGOs active in the sector. And the last point is about the fact that there is much more beyond the Fundamental Rights Impact Assessment, and go back to the previous images, that is the societal impact. The Fundamental Rights Impact Assessment just frame a part of the impact of the AI, but there are many other aspects concerning ethics and concerning the societal impact of the AI. Of course, these are not based on fundamental rights, but is based on the acceptability, social acceptability of some solution that should be context analyzed. It's not like human rights or fundamental rights that are universal. In each community, they may have different kind of attitude with regards to some use of some solution. And so this required a kind of assessment that is a community center, we can say, through engagement, through participation, so using a system that is different from the graph and the matrix that can be used in human rights. If you like the topic and you want to be more informed, of course, a bit of promotion, academic promotion. So in the book, there is more about how to combine human rights, fundamental rights impact assessment, and ethics assessment. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Mantelero, and sorry for my Cerberus role to cut and give the times. So now we go immediately to the second speaker. I only want to say something about the use of the AI also for academic purposes, because I have used some time ago the artificial intelligence to create a poster for an academic event. And one of the most important things is to create the prompts. The prompts are all the data and issues that you have to put in for example, in an image. In that case, I have used specific prompts concerning film directors and an actor or actress without any gender differences, and a crowd of students. The output was a landscape with a sea harbor, a very young film director, of course, male, and an actress, of course, woman. Very nice, and of course, Caucasian, not black, not yellow, and so on. So absolutely in the median, absolutely in the stereotype that is present in the data in the internet. So anyway, there were no elders, in the image the artificial intelligence created for me. And this is one of the topic of the next speaker, Professor Bianca Gardella Tedeschi from University of Piemonte Orientale, Digital Transformation and the Elders. It's a pleasure to give her the floor.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Do you hear me? Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Amalia, for this wonderful event. Thank you, Dr. Vergata. Thank you, Claudia, for organizing with Amalia, both of you. Thank you to the Dive Project. And thank you to our president of session that gave me the floor. So, even though I'm not that old, we have to say. So, what I would like to see with you in quite an informal way, I think, so we have a little bit more time for discussion, is the intersection of two big transformations that are taking place, especially in Europe. On the one hand, we have digitalization. On the other hand, we have a people that is increasingly aging. We have a high number of older and older persons. So the intersection of these two elements creates maybe exclusion. I would say I really liked your presentation about AI as a tool of inclusion. I'm not sure that, I mean, participation, and I'm not a sociologist, so I just received what I was able to receive. But it can be a way of participating and platforms and online things and create community. We saw in COVID that there were many communities that grow up just through online interactions. Is it true for elder people? We don't know. If we see our daily life, for sure, now that Italian population and the European population is growing old, we see many grandfathers and grandmothers that speak on Skype or whatever is the new tool now with the little grandchildren that live very far away. So in a way, this community, the family community, is kept together with digital. But in elderly people daily life, is it really so? So the data is in Europe, we have a consistent low birth rate and higher life expectancy. And according to Eurostat, by 2050, 30% of the EU's population will be age 65 and older. This is a big chunk. I mean, it's a 1/3 of people that will be 65 is the age that is commonly taken for retiring. So 1/3 of population will be out of the market labor. This demographic shift has an important economic and social implications. And we all know that 65, if we are lucky, and most of the people in Europe are lucky enough, we are still active. Out of the labor market, but still active. This digitalization in EU is proceeding very fast. And it's not only because of new technologies, but it's because the push that has been given to, by institutions to adapt to this new world, not be left behind big and important global powers. So the European Digital Decade Policy program set important goals. By 2030, which is tomorrow, 100% of key public services will be online, which means if we want to pay taxes, if we want to access healthcare that in Italy and Europe is mostly public, we have to go online. Everyone will be assigned an electronic ID, and health records can be accessible only, online. At the same time, connectivity infrastructure will be reinforced according to this program. It doesn't work that well. And the private sector will increase as well the digital transformation. The program, we have to say, it's very ambitious. The intersection is what will elderly people, not digital natives, will do in this new world. The risk of marginalization is very high. We have in our daily life people that ask us, can you access with my speed? Can you pay online? Can you do online payments through internet banking because I'm not able? I mean, I don't have to give you data. It's our daily life. At the same time, in this intersection, we have something that is very difficult from the legal point of view. It's a matter of sociologists. Older people are not a homogeneous group. We pretend that minors until 18 are homogeneous. We perfectly know that they are not, but we pretend that until 18 they are all equal. At the end of our life, the differences that actually begin at the early stage of our lives reverberates on our income, education, connections, social life, okay? So for a long time, in consumer protection, for instance, it has been said, oh, no unfair practices for older people. Older people are not a homogeneous class we cannot detect. We can say that minors, some kind of disabled people, some kind of other consumers, but older people, everyone, it's her whatever story. I don't think we can still abide to this imprinting and this rule. Already we know that, and we have to find a solution. We have to give older people a place in society where actually law, regulations, policies take into consideration some differences. That people over 65, maybe because they are out of the labor market, maybe because there is a neurological decline, which is proved by a gerontologist, need some kind of protection. We don't need to be paternalistic, but we have to take into account the fact that aging population brings a new class of persons. So going to the intersection, the analytical tool is the digital divide categorization. And this will be the last part of my paper. Let me see. I have 5 minutes, so we go fast. First level, we have 3 levels of digital divide in this field. First level concerns physical access to ICT when we don't have good internet connection, we are out. We can use everything, but we're basically out. And we know that remote villages, I live in Torino, I don't have a good connection, affects this relationship with the digital world. Second level relates to the skills needed. In 2022, 91% of people aged 16 to 74 years old has used the internet, and 7% had never used the internet. So it seems that there is a good relationship, but we put 16 to 74, so we have to go then. The third level, digital divide, concentrates on outcomes and usage related to pay taxes, pension rights, and in 2021, 59% of the same age group, which is basically everybody, I'm sorry, it's basically everybody, 16 to 74, had interact with public authorities. But if we go to the gray, the older group, we have a special categorization, which is the great digital divide. And this is what should be addressed, because it affects directly the relationship with elderly people and technologies. And it focuses on disadvantages of older persons in the use of technology. Research shows that the major challenges for older persons are participation and communication through networks and in healthcare environment. The statistics at European level, unfortunately, stop monitoring after 74 years old. So we don't have data of 75 and older, which is an important point. We can see that there are differences in how great digital divide affect groups of people. Affects women more than men, because very often women have a lower education level, and very often women through their lives have delegated to the husband everything that regards administration of the household. So when we arrive to the point that they have to take this into consideration with the digital divide, they are more affected. Of course, it affects more people with lower level of education, and poor people against more wealthy people. So it affects in different ways. I have here a report from an article on understanding older's use of technology. I myself co-wrote a book with two sociologists that gave questionnaires to older people, and one of the things that came out from their marginalization was exactly that they had problems with access to internet. They feel marginalized for this. So what can you do? What's the step forward? There are several acts and proactive steps that have been taken at European level. The Council of European Union adopted conclusions on human rights, participation and well-being for older persons in the era of digitalization, and the Council invites the Member States and the Commission to strengthen social inclusion and mutual solidarity. You see that I'm a little bit skeptical, because if you don't put this thing into action, they are just empty words. I mean, as we studied I don't know how you say in English, it's a notativo. You hope that something will happen. And sometimes these words are otativi perfect. In 2023, the European Union issued the European Declaration on Digital Rights and Principles and commits the EU to a digital transformation that benefits everyone, and in particular what is it's been repeated all over, it's a digital transformation that leaves nobody behind. The European Agency for Fundamental Rights in 2023 published the report Fundamental Rights for the Older Person, Ensuring Access to Public Services in Digital Society, with the aim of checking if fundamental rights of elderly people are respected in the digital world. It comes out that there is a big, an important marginalization of older people, and so if we confront this data with the goal of placing public services online, we can see that the risk of exclusion of older people, as I was saying before, it's really very important. I mean, it's really high. And what can you do? The problem now is, who creates marginalization? We tend to blame technology. Oh, the technology left us behind. Is it true? Or it's the way how we push the use of technology without taking care of all the population. Expanding technology without granting an adequate digital education creates the digital divide. This is what the colleague from the health department was saying yesterday. We need more education. And as I always thought, and sometimes say, when there was the car, we decided that we have to have a license to drive a car. It was not like this at the beginning. If you see old movies, they put the car in the garage with the tractor and everybody could drive it. We give this to a 7-year-old and watch cartoons, and they don't know what it is. So at some point, we need more education, first. Second, digitalization is designed and implemented by specialists. When they go in their field, they have to implement technologies, but they don't consider the difficulties that older person might have. My father, they changed how do you say, everybody, there is an update in the phone, he's lost and he has to call someone, he has an assistant for technology, very patient person that comes and explains the difference. What he has to do, he writes down every time there is an update. And then for public services and for private services, the idea is that there should be always a non-online option, okay? For instance, in internet banking, there should always be an option to go to the teller and ask for a non-electronic payment. We know that payment at the teller are much more expensive than internet banking. And who is going to the teller to make a payment not on internet banking? Not me, not you, my dad, okay? My dad, your grandfathers, they don't know how to do, they have big fingers, they don't touch the right one, they said 2,000 instead of 200, and they pay for this, and they pay. My dad bank charges €5 for every payment that is not online, okay? So this should be, these are little things that we should care about. I'm not very good at grand theory, so I think we should solve problems, and in this idea. So is it a matter of fundamental rights? I'm not sure. I'm not sure, because we create the marginal divide, and then we ask fundamental rights to fix it. It's just, we didn't think of how our population is composed, and we didn't think of this. And so we put in play big theories about fundamental rights of the elder people for things that, to me, it's created by us and should be solved without without asking grand theories to fix everything. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed. Now I give immediately the floor to Professor Maria Cecilia Paglietti, Roma Tre University, ODR and discrimination in the sharing economy. So we have another side of the same problem and topic. It's a pleasure for me to give her immediately the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, how much time do you have? How much time do I have? Because it's 10:30 and we are supposed to have a break now, so how much time? Okay, 15, 20. Okay, yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, of course, to the organization, to Dive, to Amalia, Claudia. Thank you. And it's a pleasure for me to be here today. The other one?
No, because it was...
Okay. Okay. So the question I will try to answer today is, do ODR platforms, ODR stands for Online Dispute Resolutions, on platform assure fair access to justice and provide effective protection, especially for vulnerable consumers, among them, of course, the elders. And so I will try to, più vicino, to investigate on how the use of digital dispute resolution on platform can provide a more effective protection than cards for consumers in dispute resolution between users and platforms and between users among different users. So in particular, I will focus on how technological functionalities affect the adjudicative type of dispute resolution, either automated decisions or driven by humans, where a single consumer is involved. So I will be leaving aside either the negotiation type, so the mediation and this type of dispute resolution, and the collective dimension, because of course we know that collective redress are not still very, very common online. And so basically I will be dealing with high volume, low value, and potential cross-border disputes. Well, platforms have a double role, because they are at the same time a part of the dispute and the dispute resolution service provider. So they have a double role. And in these cases, platforms embrace an adjudicative function. A typical example is content moderation. We have been talking about this yesterday. And because we all know that social media platforms have recently adopted a more explicit role as adjudicators, most likely in the light of all the attention received by content governance in public policy forums around the world. And let's just think about Facebook oversight board. And so I would rather focus on online marketplaces, the type of online transaction for platform which enable customers, either consumer or professional, to order goods and services against payment. So such as ride-sharing platform, Uber, Airbnb, and so on. So what exactly an ODR is not clear, because there's not generally accepted definition. For some, it constitutes a part of the ADR field. For some others, the inclusion of the technology as the fourth party to the dispute means that the ODR generates something completely different from the ODR in presence. I will use a simplified key to our discussion, considering the ADR as the process of out-of-court dispute resolution and ODR as ADR with the use of new technologies. So to start with, I think it would be useful to recall some common grounds about the enforcement of consumer rights. I will go very fast on this. It's been a common ground that access to justice is a basic human right, is based upon two pillars. The one is that the legal system must be equally accessible to all, and it must lead to results that are individually and socially just. And at least since Capelletti and Gart, just is considered to refer to a procedure that complies with standards of fairness. It's also been a common ground that the elaboration of models of justice is in the modern era focused on the effectiveness of protection, and that in consumer protection, access to justice and effective access to justice is intended in the sense of equality of the arms. So this is an expression which relates to the need for both substantive and procedural protection for the removal of imbalance of powers and asymmetries that preclude the access to justice. So it's at this point, at least in consumer protection, that the two topics of substantive and procedural justice arise, and with them the tension between a just decision and a fair procedure. Also, it's been a common ground, at least since Michael Middle, that we are now living in the area, in an area of pluralism of process, that the process pluralism, that citizens seek for appropriate dispute resolution. Also is a common ground that undermining the enforcement of consumer rights might be an obstacle to social and financial inclusion, and a shift from a market-based approach towards a broader consumer right approach. So on the consumer right and the substantive side, we can consider a common ground the trend to the fragmentation of the consumer, the rise of the plurality of images of consumers, and the overcome of the figure of the average consumer. So there's a shift from the normative standard of the reasonable and average consumer to the vulnerable one. Vulnerability is not the norm, is not the exception, and I think that last conference was just about these topics. This being said, when all these procedural and substantial topics are set in a digital environment, the imbalance of powers and the asymmetries may be exacerbated. And here we have Professor Sartor, who made a huge study on this. And so the question might be now, do ODR exploit consumers' vulnerabilities? And do ODR lead to discrimination in handling the dispute? So procedural justice or discrimination of the outcomes, substantive justice. So as for the first question, do ODR exploit consumer vulnerabilities? I think that in this field we can identify mainly two sources of vulnerability. The first one is redress vulnerability, including the economic one, and digital vulnerability. So as for redress vulnerability, among the studies about vulnerability and sources of vulnerability, one has been, I wouldn't say neglected, but yes, surely less debated, and is the vulnerability related to the situation where consumers are weak, have difficulties to access to justice. And this kind of weakness, this source of vulnerability, is mainly related to cost, time, and the complexity of the claim. But in detail, we have so many nuances of vulnerability. Basically, it's because consumers are likely to refrain from taking action at all because of the costs involved, or maybe because they ignorantia juris, because they are unaware of their legal rights, because consumers may feel unable to take action because of pressure that has been applied to them, and this is something related to the power of balance. Or maybe because they have a low attitude towards conflict, or maybe because there's an absence of adequate procedure to obtain restorative or compensatory protection, or maybe because the high degree of technicality requested to go to the court, and the low level of trust in the system, the nature of the cross-border nature of dispute, and the time to obtain a decision. So these are all elements that may compone redress vulnerability, but I think that the main barrier for consumers' access to justice is cost. Because below a certain value threshold, so in the case of small claims, consumers are likely to refrain from taking action. And the cost of litigation may not only outweigh any potential benefit from a victorious action, but may also be prohibitively expensive for have-nots. And here Ramsey observes that when the poor do appear, it is primarily as a defendant. So we also have to remind ourselves that in most of the legal systems, basically in all legal systems, the loser pays loser price, meaning that the loser in a lawsuit is typically required to bear the winner's legal costs. So this is another cost that someone who wants to go to court have to take into account. So if this is true, if costs are the main deterrent for going to go to the court, the intersection between instances of social and policy cohesion, there's an intersection between social policies and consumer law. And this is something new because in the legal literature, usually this link between private law, the relevance of poverty law, was basically just about public law. In this case, we have an intersection between private law and poverty law, and a link between vulnerability to the economic situation of the consumers. And here, Kaplowitz's theories on ghetto consumers are used in a modern key. So the traditional issue of the costs of dispute resolution and the quest for affordable justice, as is commonly called, overlaps with the concept of redress and economic vulnerability. So one first conclusion can be that ODR in this case helps removing the barrier of access to justice to vulnerability related to poverty law and low income. So we have here a little scheme on the issue where ODR and can help removing redress vulnerability. And since we don't have much time, I will go to basically to the conclusions, which is that 7 out of 9 sources of redress vulnerability are potentially removed by ODR. So in this perspective, ODR may be considered as inclusive rather than discriminatory dispute resolution scheme, okay? So ODR is a mean of dispute resolution for disputes that are not suitable for court litigation. In this case, ODR are inclusive, not discriminatory. So let's go to the other source of vulnerability in ODR, which is digital vulnerability. We all know that the first scholar that talked about digital vulnerability was Ryan Calo, and this is it's defined. I will go for a very brief definition as a vulnerability that depends basically on the digital environment and describes a universal state of susceptibility and exploitation of power imbalance that are the result of increasing automation of the commerce. So it's a well-known issue, and Bianca told us that the divide existing amongst certain social demographic classes is a well-known issue, and in particular, I think the digital vulnerability may affect the elders. And because when we talk about older people, we talk about age, and age is a personal characteristic that may not be compensated by other drivers, such as
education or income. So it is likely to persist due to the inability of the consumer to overcome generational barriers. And in understanding the digital dispute resolution schemes, so in the digital environment, the source of vulnerability connected with old age is not linked to the mere fact that the consumers are inept to making good decisions, nor because they have a diminished cognitive abilities, not even because they might have problems to process information, or nor because they suffer social isolation, but I think it relies on the circumstance that each generation interacts, understands, and uses technology differently. So I think that elder persons, despite a high level of education, are likely to experience generational barriers in understanding and dealing with a digital environment. So in this case, ODR are not inclusive, but they are discriminatory as a dispute resolution tool, because they don't allow some vulnerable categories of consumers to access justice. Critics. There are so many concerns about online dispute resolution. Some of them are generics and shared with ADR in general, and some others are specific. Quality is a generic concern about ADR. They are considered tools out of public control that may undermine the protection of the rights of the weaker subjects, perpetuating social inequalities by privatizing dispute resolution, by disaggregating claims for collective injustice. Some scholars claim that ADR are a second class justice. They are a Trojan horse in the access to justice paddock, that they are reserved to few primarily white, male, well-educated, middle-class, middle-aged consumers. So for these scholars think that behind the appearance of reaching an harmonious agreement, ADR conceal recourse to a series of persuasive techniques capable of discouraging the parties from insisting on asserting their rights and making them give up the legal dispute. So under this perspective, discrimination there's a discrimination in the effectiveness of protection, because they claim there would be two markets of justice for two different types of consumers: ODR for the poor and powerless and cards for the wealthy and powerful. I think this is an interesting point, because concerns about ODR are also related to the role of law that law plays in ODR, because the private sector here entails the transfer of power to set the rule of the game through a mix of law and technology. So it's interesting to note that in early 90s, scholars claimed about ADR in general, claimed for a loss of protection for poor litigants. Then in late 90s, they have been talking about loss of law, and then erosion of substantive law, and now we are just in the era of the death of law. So it's a climax. As for specific concerns, there's opacity on the procedural level, because basically we all know that neutrality is a question neutrality of decision maker is questioned in ODR because despite the role of de facto dispute managers, online platforms are private actors with commercial interests. So some marketplaces appear to treat their wealthy and valued customers with more care than they do with the less wealthy. And because in these cases, online intermediary marketplaces primarily use ODR to enhance consumer satisfaction, and the quality of justice is not the concern. And also in these cases, we have a possible discrimination of the outcomes because the rich person with a propensity for online shopping sprees in the platform's most valued customer, and thus will be treated with utmost care and benevolence by the compliant handling tools. And to go very fast to the conclusion, we also have some issue about the standards of the procedural rules, which are also very not transparent, and basically customers don't know which procedural rule have been applied in the decision that that they requested to the platforms, and so what are the remedies to this opacity and these discrimination trends in ODR? One of these of the remedy could be go to courts, but this is unlikely to happen because if we could appeal the decisions of the ODRs, of course we could have the enforcement or maybe a second chance to have a fair claim. But this is unlikely to happen for what we have been said before. So maybe a new perspective on ODR can be promoted, and here we can use the tools of the social psychologist of procedural justice, which basically said that the higher perceptions of procedural fairness lead to better acceptance of court decisions. So I think that ODR platforms should equip themselves with fair procedures in order to enhance the decision acceptance of the customer, and in order to build their trust in the ODR platform themselves. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. As you have seen, we started with more or less 20 minutes delay, and at this time we have 21 minutes delay, so it means that my colleagues have been absolutely on time, or ponctuel comme en temps de Beaulieu, as we said when we studied in France. So I think that probably we can stop here. You have time even during the coffee break to ask questions to my colleagues, and we have the last panel that starting on time. We will have also time to resume many questions together. So thank you very much again